Now, Ian Jessop on CFAX 1070.
Welcome back. When we talked to NDP leader John Horgan yesterday, we mentioned the skyrocketing provincial debt under the BC Liberals and the enormous cost overruns on mega projects. Today we're going to talk about some of those overruns with someone who's gone through the numbers and wrote a story about it last week on his website. Joining me is Damien Gillis. He's a documentary filmmaker and co-founder and publisher of the website The Common Sense Canadian. Damien, thanks for joining us.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
Damien, tell us how you got into the documentary filmmaking business and how that involved into your website that you started with Rafe Mayer.
Well, I began covering a number of issues around BC a number of years ago. About 8 years ago, I was doing corporate video production, and I started to be a little bit concerned about some of the things I was hearing in the media and the stories that were being told by political leaders about. And it started with highway projects in the region, which subsequently spiraled out of control. Other things like where Rafe and I got together was around this private river power project program around the province, the IPPs, which we both identified as not necessarily as green as they were being portrayed, that they had a lot of consequences to our rivers and fish that weren't being properly examined. But even more than that for me was it didn't seem like a good deal for ratepayers and taxpayers. And so Rafe and I began really drilling into that particular issue about 5 or 6 years ago. And a lot of the things that we warned the public and the films that I was making and speeches that Rafe was giving have come to bear. I think it's pretty fair to say that we predicted pretty much all of the problems that have come to pass, both on the environmental and economic side here. And Rafe and I, decided that we really enjoyed working together, and we wanted to create, him being out of radio at that point, that we wanted to create a media platform to really look out for the public interest around these sorts of issues and how we manage our resources and economy. And we've continued on with that. And today we continue to examine things like the proposed liquefied natural gas program and the ongoing issues with BC Hydro, rising bills, and the mega project that's on the table now, which is Site C Dam, which carries an $8 billion price tag, but we figure is going to end up costing taxpayers and ratepayers a heck of a lot more than that. So we're here to be kind of the eyes and ears for the BC and Canadian public, and really look at these programs as they're presented and decide what makes sense for the public and where they're not being told the truth.
Damien, let's go through some of the mega projects of the Liberals, which you wrote about on your website, because some of them I didn't realize they were so over budget. And you start the first one, the Port Mann Bridge, 550% of the initial estimate. I mean, that's astounding.
Sure, and I think what you'll notice here, one of the tricks that we see is even in places where the government has declared that a project is on time and on budget, it often involves revisions throughout the process where it's not actually compared to the initial estimate, but at some point along the way, there's been a number that's been floated initially to garner interest, and it's usually very low to make people feel comfortable with it. And then at some point, the number will change, and then it will change again. And so by the time you get to the end of it, it might feel like it's only doubled or it's only gone up 20 or 30%. But if you trace it back to the very first statements that were being made, as is the case here with this bridge, it was initially $600 million, and that's Canadian Taxpayer Federation has documented this on their website. And that went up then to $1.5 billion, and then the public-private partnership they were trying to put together on it fell through with a big Australian company, Macquarie, and ultimately they ended up hiring Peter Kiewit and Sons and Flatiron Constructors, and the project wound up being, with management and maintenance costs going forward, $3.3 billion. So that's how you get from $600 million to basically being 550% of that initial estimate. And this is a pattern that has repeated itself right across the board. And what strikes me is, and I'm not approaching this in a partisan way, I think certainly many of the concerns about the NDP in the past, John Horgan's party when they were in power, they made their share of mistakes too. We're here to be a watchdog for the public either way, no matter who's in power. But you see, I think there's a certain unfairness in the narrative where the NDP of the 90s were cast as being just terrible fiscal managers, and somehow the governing party today has gotten away with a lot worse without having their reputation suffer in the same way.
Yeah, they've never had their knuckles rapped because they always repeat the narrative on time and on budget. And very rarely are they on time or on budget. And the next project you talk about is the BC Place Stadium roof upgrade, which the original cost was only going to be $100 million.
Yeah, that was a letter that was written from David Podmore, who's the chairman of PAVCO that runs BC Place, wrote to Vancouver City Manager Judy Rogers, and that initial figure that was used was $100 million, which sounds reasonable for a roof upgrade. There are stadiums being built today, certainly with the World Cup in Brazil. We've seen in Russia, and we've seen costs really going up with some of these mega projects. But at the time and throughout the early 2000s, late 1990s, it was pretty typical to build a stadium for $300 or $400 million. So to put a new roof on a stadium, you would think that sounds fairly reasonable. Mm-hmm. But what ended up happening there is it reached $514 million, and then we also see this problem where it doesn't even work. It doesn't do the job it was designed to do. It's a retractable roof, which was a big part of the expense, but it doesn't open up in the rain. And anybody who lives in Vancouver can see where the problem is. That how many football games are you going to be able to count on going to, or soccer games where it isn't potentially raining in Vancouver? So we're not even getting the value that we're paying for here. The Seahawks paid $365 million for their entire stadium just a few years before we undertook this project, and we paid $514 million for a roof that doesn't even work properly.
Damien, one of the cost overruns was the Northwest Transmission Line, and I'm not sure many listeners, including myself, are really aware of what that's all about. Can you take us through that?
Sure. There are a lot of new mines that are proposed for the northwest region of the province, and we're talking going even further north from Terrace, if for some of your listeners will be just for location 300-400 kilometers north of there. In Tahltan First Nation area, it's called the Sacred Headwaters, also referred to Iskut, Dees Lake sort of region. Mm-hmm. And there are quite a few mines proposed up there, and there's not enough power to provide their needs. So this line really, to anybody who's been observing it closely, can see that was the purpose for it. Now, kind of contradictory to that was the government was able to access the province $130 million under the federal government's Green Infrastructure Fund. That was because the First Nations communities up there are running on diesel power, which doesn't burn very clean. So the idea was, while we do this and while we power these mines, let's build a spur off of them into those communities and provide them with greener power out of our hydro system. And so the Fed said, we'll cover some of that cost. We'll give you $130 million towards that. Again, in terms of the mismanagement on this project, my reading of the contract, all that we had to do in order to qualify for that money was to submit a file on plan in 2012, and we missed the deadline by 9 months. So theoretically, the federal government can come back and reclaim that $130 million, which is going to have to be borne by BC Hydro and the taxpayer. So this is another example here where this project started out at $404 million. It's up to $736 now, and I think we can expect the cost to be much higher by the time the final tally is in. And certainly, there could be some benefit here in terms of providing economic stimulus by way of the mining industry. But to what degree should ratepayers, your listeners, be paying higher power bills as a result of this in order to subsidize industry? That's an important question that we're not really discussing. And certainly, if you're going to do it, you got to do the basics to keep a project on budget. And I was just recently interviewing a business person in Fort St. John, where the Site C dam would be built. And he's been following these issues and really considering what value it might bring to the community and what the potential trade-offs are as a taxpayer and some of the larger issues. And he made the comment, look, in my line of work, in the real world, in the construction world, you can forgive a 10% variance from the budget, but not 200% or 300%. That's been the pattern here, and it's very troubling.
Let's, before the commercial break, let's finish up with one more. The Vancouver Trade and Convention Center, $178 million. It was supposed to be $500 million. It ended up being nearly $900 million.
Yeah.
I think the interesting thing in all of these is the NDP were criticized, and probably rightly so, for the cost overruns on the fast ferries. And that became really the narrative for their 10 years in office.
Sure.
And but the Liberals, all these mega projects that you've outlined now, went way over budget, costing the taxpayers hundreds of millions of dollars more than anything the NDP did. And it strikes me, and you mentioned this, why doesn't the NDP fight back?
Well, that would be an interesting question. I didn't get a chance to hear your interview with John Horgan yesterday, but I would have been curious to hear his response to that. I think that there was a decision made by Adrian Dix to run a gentle campaign, a Mr. Nice Guy sort of approach.
Yeah.
And as Rafe commented many times on our website, the Common Sense Canadian at the time was that just, politics is a blood sport. It's not, nice guys don't finish first in this business. And I think, you can set aside whether you want to be the morality of it, whether you want to be a nice guy or not. The public needs the opposition to hold the government's feet to the fire and be tough on them, especially when their money's being misspent. And it's totally justified to take them to task on these sorts of issues. And clearly, they decided not to do that. And the cost overruns that this government, all the projects that I mentioned here in this story, are pretty much all of them, I think, are far more significant cost overrun to taxpayers than that single fast ferry project, which was a couple $100 million. And now we're talking much bigger. And one of the key differences similarities between those two projects, the convention center, is the Campbell government at the time chastised the NDP for not having somebody running the project who had the kind of background in building ships, and they also chastised them for not having the plans completed so that they knew exactly what they were getting into, and they made the same mistakes with the convention center. That's why we couldn't get a fixed price contract with PCL constructors that built the convention center. They didn't have finished blueprints, and the government kept going back and tweaking them and changing things and asking for new things, and so ultimately the cost kept going up. And they had a fellow in there, Ken Dobell, who really didn't have any experience overseeing projects like this, so they made the same mistakes the NDP did.
Damien Gillis is our guest. He's a documentary filmmaker and co-founder and publisher of the website The Common Sense Canadian. We'll take a break, and we'll come right back. Damien, you'll recall that Premier Christy Clark announced the BC Prosperity Fund, and she bragged it would accumulate between $100 billion and $260 billion in revenues from liquefied natural gas royalties and business taxes to wipe out the province's debt by 2028. Now, a regular guest on this program, former accountant Norm Farrell, who has the blog Northern Insight, calculated the government would need net revenue, that's net revenue of $6.3 billion a year from natural gas. But today, its net revenue is only $100 million net after subsidies. Why do we fall for this sort of hype?
That's a good question, and you could also ask that to the NDP, who again, during this last election campaign, really didn't differentiate itself on that file at all. They pretty much went along with it, but I think it's a narrative that's appealing at a time when people are looking for something to get us out of our financial troubles. I think it was very well told. I think Premier Clark is a good salesperson, and I think we didn't really have, the media didn't have the kind of time to drill into it, or necessarily the resources or the wherewithal to do it.
The time or inclination.
Yeah, there you go, during the election cycle. So it sort of it sounded good. People looked at it, beside the NDP, who weren't really offering much different and didn't have this big kind of business vision to propel the province forward. And what's a mystery to me, though, is that they continue with this story, and they've continued really harping on it. I went and attended their big LNG global conference in Vancouver a couple months ago, and the rhetoric is pretty much the same at this point. And on that very day, Russia and China had just signed a $400 billion deal that is very impactful on our potential to sign similar deals for LNG with China, who's one of our biggest target customers here. And it was as though nothing had even happened, to change the story. The thing with this royalty and tax regime that they're proposing is it finally came out. We've been waiting to see a glimpse of it for a long time, and we finally got a peek at it in the last budget in May. And the way it works is the first phase, it's a two-phase thing. In the first phase, which is probably 3 to 5 years, is only 1.5% export tax on the LNG, which they get back, the industry, once they go into phase 2. So there's nothing really paid or retained under the first 5 years. And then the phase 2, it rises to 7%, but they're able to deduct their capital costs. And some of these projects in places like Australia, Chevron's building a plant there, it's up to $55 billion, and it's still not finished. It's $20 billion over budget. So you talk about cost overruns. LNG is an industry that's particularly vulnerable to those kinds of risks. So we can expect to see the same sort of thing here. And if they don't have to pay anything until they've recouped their $15 or $20 billion project costs to get running here, then I don't think we can expect to see an extra penny from these export taxes on LNG for at least 20 years, which takes us beyond, or actually takes us well beyond that point of 2028. The numbers have shifted all over the place here too, as you just illustrated a little bit. But we're always hearing the baseline is constantly shifting. So it's really very much a fairy tale that continues to evolve here. And Mr. Farrell's absolutely right. If you look at our royalties right now, we're talking like $100 million a year. That would you have to increase that by 60-fold and sustain that for a 20-year period just to get to what they're promising.
One of the absolute disasters, I think, that has happened in this province that really hasn't got the attention of the public or the media are the independent power projects. And taxpayers of this province are on the hook for contractual obligations for these folks to $60 billion. I mean, it is just an astounding amount of money.
Sure.
And there seems to be no criticism of this at all. I just don't. I can't understand this.
Yeah, I mean, this is the thing that got Rafe and I both very hepped up a number of years ago when we were starting to see this, and we're talking like 6 years ago now that we started predicting these sorts of things. And certainly there was a fair amount. I think it's an issue that has riled up British Columbians in a lot of ways, but it's kind of died down, and a lot of the bigger projects fell through. But we've already got a significant amount of these commitments on the table, and there's a direct connection. I mean, Dan Potts, who used to be the head of the Major Industrial Power Users Association in British Columbia, representing the mining and sawmill industry, pulp mills, etc., he just had a great op-ed piece in the Vancouver Sun the other day, and he draws a straight line between this government's energy policy, and particularly these IPPs, and the fact that ratepayers are seeing their power bills go through the roof. And we're talking a 28% predicted increase over the next few years. That's on top of rising costs in recent years, and I think we're just looking at the tip of the iceberg. I think it's partly that the media wasn't critical enough of it or didn't look into it enough. I think the opposition didn't quite wrap their heads around it and fathom just how serious this was. We talk about things like the education situation right now, and all of these issues, the hospital concerns. You can tie them back at the end of the day to mismanagement of our resources. And not only has this government is on track by 2016 to double the debt that they inherited from $34 billion in 2001 up to $68 billion But there's this whole shadow debt, which they've essentially swept under the rug, and we don't see it. But the Auditor General has identified it. It includes those $60 billion of private power contracts, plus a whole bunch of other commitments we've made through public-private partnership deals on building infrastructure, and it's $100 billion now. So when you and those are bills that your listeners and their children and their children's children are going to have to continue paying over the years.
Yeah, absolutely.
Their power bills and their taxes, and we're not getting a full picture of it.
Damien, it was great to talk to you. We'll have to do this again.
My pleasure.
Yeah, I appreciate it.
Okay.
Damien Gillis, documentary filmmaker and co-founder, publisher of the website The Common Sense Canadian.